Charging returning Kiwis for isolation is a complicated proposition, according to a public law expert who recommends the government pass a completely new piece of legislation to get the job done. But Mai Chen reckons the bigger challenge is the ticking clock, with Parliament due to break up in 2 weeks' time.
We've got a situation where we want to ensure that we are properly treating everybody fairly. They do have a right to movement. Citizens have a right to come back to the country. If they can't come back to the country, they can't access their families, their houses, their jobs. So obviously we then need to also have exemptions. Some people aren't going to be able to afford that, but they still need to come back. So what do we do? Do we give them exemptions? Do we means test them? The issue here is being fair. Enforcement is also hard. What happens if they don't pay? Are you going to throw them in jail? How are you going to penalise them? How are you going to enforce this? And also, there are issues about cost recovery. Some people have said, well, look, it's a blanket yes or a blanket no. If you try and have everybody making an application, I've got a good excuse for being back. I don't. I just decided to hop out and spend some time in Paris and come back, and therefore I should pay. It just makes it too hard. It costs too much. It's like the GST argument. By the time you've figured out all the exemptions, it's easier just to have a blanket charge. So I don't think it's easy.
So in terms of the right to return home to New Zealand, if you're a citizen or a permanent resident, is that a supreme right, or are there some circumstances where they can charge you? For example, that may exclude you from returning if you don't have the means to pay. So what is the supreme right here? Is it your right as a citizen or a permanent resident?
That's why I say legislation is a good idea, because Parliament is sovereign. And at the end of the day, passing legislation trumps all. The New Zealand Bill of Rights says that every New Zealand citizen has the right to enter New Zealand, but it's subject to Section 5, which says that you're able to be subject to reasonable limitations demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So let's face it, public health justification. Look, it's absolutely critical. At the moment we have a policy in New Zealand of elimination. We've got no community transmission. That border defence is absolutely critical to us. So you could argue that because of that, limitations can be put on the right to freedom of movement. But let's face it, if you're a citizen and you leave the country and you can't get back in and you can't afford it, I think that's just going to be too gross an imposition. Most importantly, Lisa, are we going to spend all our time in court? Is everyone going to have to challenge, grab a lawyer, do-si-do, head down to court and say, well, hang on, this was demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society, this wasn't. The difficulty here is to come up with some sort of scheme that isn't going to be the subject of constant court challenge. But at the same time, Parliament is rising next week. So if they want to pass legislation, they're going to have to get the bill drafted, make sure it's workable and practical, get it into Parliament, pass it through all three stages. I presume this means that the select committee stage will be totally truncated. We've now got, expats in London who've formed a group and are going to try and challenge. We've got a challenge group in New Zealand. This isn't easy. And I think given all of these challenge groups, it really points the pathway also to legislation. Legislation trumps all. You get a piece of legislation that says you are able to do this in these circumstances, very hard to challenge it.
But given all the issues that you've just outlined, the time that there is to get this done, is it worth it?
I think it is, because, we're being told that they've already spent $750 million. That's a lot of money. It's your money, it's my money, it's taxpayers' money. The question is whether it's sustainable. And look, let's face it, if some people just want to zot out and have a quick holiday, well, they can pay on their way back. But if you happen to be overseas and there's no other way to come home and you can't afford, $3,000 at the border, well, that may be a different story. So the question is, how do you devise a system with clear discretionary ability to take into account the facts of everyone's situation, but not make it so complicated that it just eats up a whole bunch of resource to implement it, and you end up with just a huge rolling maul of court cases with people challenging?
So what would be a reasonable limitation on your return in terms of a financial limitation? So if you then have to choose a figure that's a limitation, having to pay, a limitation on your freedom of movement, what's a reasonable financial limitation then, by definition?
Well, you see, what's reasonable depends on how much you earn, Lisa. If you don't earn very much, I mean, when I act for people who don't earn very much, what is reasonable for them is completely different. So I think the means testing is important. And remember, part of the reason why we also need legislation is that at the moment, the government's saying to people, oh, feel free, come back, we'll foot the bill. You go to the Sheraton for 2 weeks. And actually, there's no ability for them to do that either. There's no piece of legislation that says actually you can just pay for everybody who's coming back in to the tune of, 750 million and, heading towards $1 billion. So that's why I say this is complicated. And when the Honourable Megan Woods says it's complicated, she's right, because you are having to make those decisions taking into account the facts of every person's situation. And that includes their means, but it also includes why they are wanting to come back in and why they left.
So if you're paying, does that mean you should have some choice? For example, some people would consider that some of the hotels on offer are much better than others. So if you're going to be forced to pay, should you then have choice?
Oh, I love it. So we're going to have a wait list for the Hyatt because you don't want to go to the Commodore or the Copthorne. Look, at the end of the day, this is about public health and safety. So I think there are limits to the extent of discretion you have. And it's also clear, Lisa, that, whatever they're going to charge you is not how much it's going to cost. We know that because it doesn't, it may pay for the food and it may pay for your room, but it's not going to pay for the security. If we continue to have to put people to stop you cutting your way through gates, fences, breaking windows. There's going to be a much, much higher cost. So at the end of the day, there's going to be a bit of user pays. So we need to be realistic about that. You're not going to be footing the whole bill. So I think you go where you are told. COVID has fundamentally changed the relationship between government and citizens. In the bid to protect all of our health and safety, we still need to ensure that there is lawfulness and transparency because people's rights are being affected.
So, Mai, here's the checkpoint challenge then. Given that there's 2 weeks before the House rises, could you write a rock-solid piece of legislation that accounts for all these nuances? Well, we'll give you 7 to 10 days because you still have to get it before the House. Can you do it?
Well, that is so generous of you, Lisa. And I'd accept the challenge. If I was going to do it, I would stand back. I'd probably make it quite permissive. I wouldn't make it too prescriptive. It's easier to get it wrong when it's highly prescriptive. Probably what I'd do is I'd give quite a bit of power, but then I'd say that they could draft regulations, which can then provide the detail.